Hi there, I'm Andy Owen. I'm the International Technical Manager for ICL Turf and Landscape. And I want to introduce the first of a series of 6 technical update videos that we're putting on where we're discussing integrated turf management or integrated pest management with a focus on the management of Microdochium nivale or Microdochium patch disease for cool season turfgrass. In future updates, we're hoping to look at a general discussion about what integrated turf management is. I'm going to be joined by some of my colleagues to have a look at an overview, if you like, of some of the very successful and extensive research that ICL have done about managing Microdochium patch disease on cool season turfgrass, and also a session where we look at the practical outcomes from that disease, so what the turf manager can do to help manage disease on their surfaces. We're also hopefully will be joined by Glenn Kirby from Syngenta, where we can discuss how we would incorporate the use of fungicides into an integrated turf management program. So there's lots of bits to cover, but this is the first one. And on this first session, we want to focus down on the biology or the pathology of Microdochium nivale. And I'm really pleased to say that we're joined in this by Kate Entwistle from the Turf Disease Centre. Thank you so much for joining, Kate. Really pleased you could come and do one of these technical updates with us. I think it'd be good to start maybe for those people watching who have not heard you speak or met you in person. Could you just give us a brief introduction to your background and what sort of work you do at the Turf Disease Centre?
Yes, thank you, Andy, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to help you. And yeah, I'm looking forward to chatting about the disease. So my background is really in turf pathology. Started at the SGRI in 1990, and I worked there for 10 years. And then since 2000, I've worked independently for myself from home. So I've got a small home lab. And the Turf Disease Centre was set up really just to help turf managers to identify turf fungal disease problems. But we quickly realised that there was an interaction between other pests and fungal disease development. So for the past probably 18 years or more, I've been working closely with Dr. Colin Fleming over at AFBI and his team, and they have taught me to identify plant parasitic nematodes, and together we're understanding this interaction between the root parasites and the development of fungal disease. So basically what we do is help turf managers to identify whatever problems are developing, identify the cause or causes, and then hopefully give them all of the options that are available at the time to manage these things. So I work, as I say, closely with Colin with regards to the nematodes, and I also enjoy working as an independent. It allows me to do research collaboratively with other organisations around the world. So although I don't do pure research myself, I'm able to contribute to research in that way.
That's really interesting. Thank you. So what are you getting through your door at the moment? What's keeping you busy at this period in 2020?
Well, for the first few months, nothing came in at all. So everything was nice and quiet, and I got on with a few jobs around the house. And then suddenly courses and facilities opened and the floodgates opened. And so now I'm swamped with disease problems. There's a lot of take-all coming in at the moment. Take-all patch is active. And I suppose the thing that's taking most of the time is assessing the root zones for plant parasitic nematodes. People want to be on top of that and to see what the populations are, how they're building, and what kind of stress they're likely to get coming in on the plant as we go through the summer. So yeah, just routine analysis on that part.
That's really interesting. It's interesting you say that because I think it would make a really good future technical update to talk a little bit about plant parasitic nematodes. And I'm obviously the work you do will be connecting to the project we've got running with Royal Holloway and Townsend Williams looking at managing nematodes in turf. So there may be one for the future. But perhaps we should come back to the case in point. I want to talk about Microdochium nivale. Let's start really simply. So how serious a disease is Microdochium patch for cool season turf grasses, and what can you tell us about the biology of the disease?
I think it's arguably the most important disease that we have to manage because it can affect all turf grasses. And although we generally consider it to be sort of a late summer, autumn, winter disease, it can occur at any time of the year. So it's more the environmental conditions that are the driver. So if we have a nice cool, wet period during the early part or during the summer, then we can get the disease flaring up. So this is arguably the most important one that we have to manage, and to not confuse it with anything else, so that we can manage it appropriately or correctly. So the pathogen, we talked about it just now, saying it can come at any time of the year, and it really is the weather, the conditions that will influence the disease development. The fungus itself is what I call a happy saprophyte. So it's very, very capable of living without causing disease in the thatch or the organic matter at the base of the turf. And that's really one of the key ways that we can manage it. We can look at that later on. So it lives happily in the thatch and the organic material, and it will proliferate, produce a huge number of spores. And these spores, along with the mycelium of the fungus, will allow this disease to develop very quickly in stressed turf. So we've got a fungus that is capable of growing very actively in cool conditions, and most of the fungi that cause disease aren't capable of growing at that temperature. So in a way, it doesn't have the competition. When the conditions are right for it to cause disease, the other pathogens aren't able, or the other organisms aren't able to antagonize it. So that's one of the reasons it can flare up really quickly in cool conditions.
That's really interesting, actually. I love the way you put that and described it as a happy saprophyte. I think is quite a nice way to think about it. Okay, so that's a bit of the background. So on to the identification. So if a turf manager believes they might have microdochium, what are the clear ID features that you would recommend they look for, or that you look for in the disease to make a positive identification?
Right. Well, one thing to remember with most of our turf diseases, not all, but most, and certainly with Microdochium, is that if it occurs in one area at one time, it's likely to come back into that area because it's the local environmental conditions that would encourage it. So if you've had it in the past, keep an eye out on those areas for the same kind of symptoms starting to show. And initially, you would start to see very small patches of discoloured turf, quite often a darkish brown colour. But the key characteristic is that the leaf will be wet. We say it's water soaked. So the fungus goes in and breaks down the internal structure of the leaf, and it becomes very wet. And that fungal infection will spread very quickly, particularly if there's water on the leaf surface. So that will allow the fungal infection to spread very quickly. You may or may not see aerial mycelium, but you will see on close mown turf very distinct circular patches. So it's one of those diseases that when it's active, it grows as circles. Most other diseases are diffuse patches. And so Microdochium, look out for very obvious circular patches, dark brown, and expanding relatively quickly. Okay. When the disease is really active as well, I should say in the centre of the patches, you will see a tan colour to the leaf, but the outside of the patch will be much darker. And we say it's like a gravy brown colour rather than a red brown, which would be more take-all patch. So it's a gravy dark brown colour.
Excellent, thank you. That was really clear now and really useful. So you've mentioned a couple of these already, but let's run through them in sequence. What are the conditions for the development of the disease? So what environmental factors are really important here?
The key driver is the duration of leaf wetness. So water on the leaf through irrigation or rainfall, relative humidity, these kind of factors, anything that keeps the leaf wet will basically allow the fungal spores to germinate, to grow, and that mycelium to enter the plant. And it's that key period from when the spores of the fungus germinate to when the fungus gets inside the plant, which is really key in managing the disease. If we don't stop that early infection, then the fungus is infected and then it will just progress to the full disease. So the key driver is leaf wetness. The other driver is the thatch, the organic material, because that's where it lives saprophytically and allows a huge buildup of what we call inoculum, the fungal spores. And then the other thing is the health of the plant. So the nutrient status of the plant, the height of cut, and the stress, the overall stress on the turf. So if the plant is low in nitrogen, and I think there's a lot of research to show low potassium as well has an influence, but certainly nitrogen, then we can see more outbreaks of disease and more aggressive disease. And also, if we take the height of cut below the ideal for that particular grass type, then there is also more potential for the disease to develop.
Really good. No, that's really clear, and obviously that links very nicely, I think, with some of the research that we've seen and some of the research points that we want to talk about in some of the future technical updates. You know, particularly talking about keeping the surface of the canopy as dry as possible and taking moisture away from the surface quickly. So no, that is good. Okay, so moving on, maybe this is a bit more of a difficult question, I guess, but in terms of the practical management of Microdochium, a lot of the conversation focuses around the early identification of the disease, sometimes maybe before the symptoms are clear or the symptoms are visible on the plant. Certainly if you want to make, say, a preventative fungicide application, you know, getting that timing is quite critical. So what can you tell us about the first few days of infection, if you like, or before those symptoms appear? What are the key points that the turf manager needs to think about?
I think one of the things that you can quite often see is just a general discoloration through the turf, and that's an accumulation of the fungus in the lower leaf tissues. Okay. And if you know your turf, then you can see that slight change in the colour. And it might be a good idea for the turf manager to take out a core sample and put it inside a sealed plastic bag. So you've made like a little incubation chamber for the turf. Put that in your office overnight. And if the Microdochium is active at the base of the turf, then it will grow up and you'll see the mycelium the following morning. So that will give you an early indication that there's active disease there. And then you can go out and spray, because you're always likely to have some level of activity of the fungus in the older leaf tissue, but that it doesn't automatically mean it's going to come up onto the leaf and cause disease. But at least then you would know that the fungus is active and you can do something about it before it has the potential to get onto the leaf. And the other thing I would say as well is use all of the information that's available now on monitoring the environmental conditions, and be aware that the disease will come in under cool, wet conditions. And so look at what the temperature is going to be like and the rainfall or whatever in your area and on your greens that are most affected first. And then you can put together a plan that's specific for you in managing the disease, because I can give you a general idea about the conditions, but really it is a local environmental condition that will encourage the development of the disease. But there are a lot of applications out now that allow you to monitor environmental conditions.
Yeah, so they're almost like the programs that give you that sort of disease indicator or Absolutely. The level of pressure, and you see them as being successful and a good way to monitor that locally.
They are an excellent tool to use, yes. I mean, they can't predict it 100%, but they can certainly give you a very good indication that you should perhaps be scouting a little bit more carefully, perhaps take a turf sample, put it in a bag, just see if the disease is likely to develop in your course at this time. So they are very, very useful tools indeed, yes.
In terms of taking a core sample and sealing it, that doesn't have to be very big, I assume. And how can you be certain that if you see hyphae developing that it will be Microdochium, or could you get something else and mistakenly identify it?
It's a really good question. You won't be able to see from the mycelium that it is Microdochium, but what you can do is take the presence of the active mycelium developing on the turf, along with the local environmental conditions, and put all these little bits of the jigsaw piece together, puzzle together. And so for your area, you can say, well, we can discount Rhizoctonia, for example, because that likes warm, wet conditions. So it's not that. And it's not dollar spot, because the symptoms don't look right. There's no water soaking and so on. So you can put together all of these different symptoms that you can see, the environmental conditions and the mycelium, and say, well, it's a pretty good chance that it's active Microdochium. The only way to be absolutely certain is to see the fungal spores, which you'd need a microscope for. And a lot of turf managers now are equipping themselves with microscopes to look at the fungi. But again, you need to know what you're looking for in order to do that. It might be just as well to send a sample into a lab and they can confirm the presence of the spores for you. That's one thing that you can do, to be sure.
And if they wanted to send a sample into you, for example, I assume they can find information about what they need to send on your website, on the Turf Disease Centre website?
They can do, yes. I'd be more than happy to do that. There are other labs that do this, but yes, I'm more than happy to look at the samples for them. And actually, Microdochium is one of the easiest ones to identify when it's active, because it produces so many spores, like a little fingerprint. So once we see that, we know what you've got.
Brilliant, Kate. Thank you so much for your time today. That was really clear. I love the answers that you gave, and I'm sure it will be super helpful for people. So thanks again for joining. Thanks to all those of you that are watching. Please keep an eye out for the future episodes in this sort of short technical update series. So I hope you'll catch up with those as well. And just leave it to say thanks very much and goodbye from us. Goodbye.